Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this wonderful lecture session from the horror program at the University of the Underground. I'm Maggie Haynes. I'm head of the horror program, which is a critical exploration into illicit societal fears and human passion for horror. So we're going to be investigating institutions and popular culture through the lens of the horror genre in dramaturgy, film, costume making, and more. So University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic and transnational university. It was founded in 2017 and birthed in the basements of nightlife venues. So we're non-profit, we're a registered charity. If you'd like to donate, please visit universityoftheunderground.org. On this website, you can find loads of other exciting program times and events. And you can also find this all on the Instagram. So I'm really excited because we're joined by Tracy Jarvis today. So after 10 years experience as a psychotherapist and nearly 20 years of experience in the field of psychology and healing, Tracy's consistently moved to better her understanding, clinical knowledge and treatment of the impact of trauma and adversity on individuals, families and communities. They're a UKCP registered psychotherapist and specialise in trauma, stress and neuroscience. That means she's specifically trained to work with trauma and developmental trauma. She had the privilege to work underneath and be supervised by world-renowned trauma and attachment expert Janina Fisher PhD, and worked with individuals on a range of symptoms and diagnosis from anxiety, depression and PTSD to DID and borderline personality disorder. So that means that she works with various types of abuse or with individuals who are recovering from some kind of trauma, developmental trauma or stress-related disorder. So more widely, she's the director of PESI UK, which is formerly the founder and director of Psychotherapy Excellence, a non-for-profit organisation and the largest CPD and training portal in the UK and Europe, and teaches and consults on stress, trauma and neuroscience for various organisations in the UK and internationally. So thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you, Tracy.
Oh, thanks so much, Aggie, and yeah, thanks so much for having you all here. And yeah, so I'm sure you guys are the creatives. I'm sure how this is going to kind of sort of transform into sort of like the horror and the creative of what you're doing, but I hope it will give you a perspective. And I'm going to share some slides. So we're really going to be looking at trauma and adversity, and really how we understand trauma and adversity. So from molecule to mind, we're going to take a deep dive into the brain. I'm going to tell you a little bit about epigenetics and clinically how we work and how it really just kind of shows up day to day. Even if you're, even if you're not coming in or have had any trauma and adversity, it's sort of really quite easy to recognize. So let me share my screen. And let me know if you can. Let's just take a look. Can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. So, so I'm just moving something here. Okay, so as Aggie said, I'm a specialist in trauma, and I work with all sorts of kind of, let's put the word in, horror scenarios, and literally I mean horror scenarios. So I don't want to sort of, put play into that, because actually there's kind of horrific things that happen in the world, and I'm one of those sort of specialists who helps people really overcome, just a whole lot of stuff that happens to them. Okay, so let's start off, right? We're going to take our journey into the brain. So I want to introduce you to some terminology. We're going to look at how do we harness the power of what we call neurobiology. So you're probably thinking, what the hell is neurobiology? Well, neurobiology is like all about how our neurons and the different types of sort of brain cells work in our heads. So if you think about your brain, and you might know this, you might not, we've got 100 billion neurons. That's a lot of brain cells. And we've got, almost 100 trillion synapses. So that's kind of where like the brain cells interact with different kinds of cells in our brain. And if you think about that, we then sort of have this massive amount of chemical and molecular processes that give rise to like our behaviors and our thinking and our mind and our physiological responses and just us being human. So you can imagine the amount of energy and power that's just coming from what's between our ears. And what's between our ears consists of, you know, a lot of kind of neuroscience and science right now is all about neurons. So you would have heard of the things kind of like brain cells, but there are other kinds of sort of cells in the brain. And I want to bring in the term sort of glia, which you can read off the slide. And there's not actually a lot of research around glia. So you'll see that current neuroscience and current trauma science is actually quite neurocentric, where actually we want to start thinking about sort of a glia-centric version of what's happening in the brain, and where kind of neurons and glias come together to give rise to sort of mental health challenges or diagnoses, which I will sort of start to come on to. Now, I'm going to be kind of really simplistic with this lecture, not because of any of you, it's just because I could honestly talk for days, months and years about the brain and about what I do, but we've only got, I think now, 32 minutes left, so I've got to get moving. So think about it, we've got our nervous system, and that's really, if I break that down, think about sensations, emotions, our impulses, so how we see the world, how we smell flowers or nice cakes, how we move to one another or move away from, how we have emotions or affect, so sadness, joy, pleasure, grief, being afraid, fear, you name it. You know, these are really just the building blocks of this wonderful body that we all inhabit every day. And if we look at those building blocks, we can take them into sort of something called the autonomic nervous system. Very simplistically, we've got sympathetic nervous system. So that's responsible for our fight and our flight response. Definitely something, I don't know about you, I know about me. If I'm watching horror on TV, I'm really crap at watching any thrillers, horrors, because it sets off my sympathetic nervous system. And then we've got on the other side that parasympathetic nervous system. So that's like kind of like really chill and relax. You kind of like on Ibiza, you've got a drink in the hand, you're watching the ocean, listening to some, you know, tunes. And that's definitely not what happens in my body if I'm watching a horror film or I'm looking at blood or gore or anything like that. So again, you might be a person where actually it doesn't really phase your sympathetic nervous system and you feel relaxed looking at blood and gore. I don't know, Aggie, maybe that's, you know, I've seen some of your work. I don't know what happens in your system, but when I went onto your website, I was just like, oh my God, I can't even look there. So again, I want you to be thinking about through your senses, everything that's going on while you're doing the project, what you're doing with the University of the Underground. And I'm really hoping that what I'm talking about might just give you a little bit of understanding of what's going on. So we've got this autonomic nervous system broken into two parts. Our brain is not only sort of made up of sort of structures, like, for example, many of you would have heard of the amygdala. Some of you might have heard about the prefrontal cortex. Probably not many of you would have heard about the superior corticuli or Broca's area. Again, those are brain structures, and those brain structures actually work in tandem with what we call brain networks. So some of you might heard of the default mode network, the attentional network. So what neuroscience and what people like me are really interested in is that, you know, when trauma happens, when adversity happens, what the hell's going on in the brain to, you know, bring people either into my clinic or into hospital. And then the other thing about the brain, and you're probably thinking, why the brain? Well, the brain is really the seat of, and the body, I'm kind of bringing those two terms together, it's really the seat of trauma and adversity. And it is, you know, part of our human anatomy that really certain structures and networks are the seat of our implicit memory. So pretty much what I'm talking about there is, you know, stuff that you're unconscious to. And then explicit memory, the things that you remember, like when I went to Paris last time, I remember this. Yesterday I did that. A couple of weeks ago, had such a great sort of experience with some friends. So again, that brain, in terms of maybe if you're relating it to horror, you might want to think about memory. But overall, the brain is an exceptional computing system. So you can see those 100 billion neurons interacting with each other to give us exceptional computing power. Okay, so, a question that we want to think about is that we've got all this like chemical and molecular sort of activity going on in our mind, sorry, in our brain, but how the hell does it give rise to our psychological well-being or our mind? So just think about it. Take a moment to think about our blood in our head and our kind of blood and guts. How does that create a mind? Now, I don't know about you, I'm totally fascinated by that because I'm not into horror. I don't like blood and guts. But when I think about how does that biological kind of translate to psychological, I get kind of really interested in that interface. So I'm going to mention some people, some research here that are kind of different mind research. So Dan Siegel, if you don't know who Professor Dan Siegel is, he's professor of psychiatry at UCLA. He talks about the mind in terms of energy and information flow that can be organized when we're good and feeling great and disorganized when we're not feeling great. We have subjective experiences such as like images, our thoughts, our beliefs, our meaning making, our judgments, our reasoning, our perceptions that we kind of, think about in terms of ourselves, in terms of one another, in terms of the world around us. And many of you would have heard about, Freud, Sigmund Freud, and he came up with the id, the ego, and the superego. You would have heard about Jung, who came up with sort of the self and Jung archetypes. Perhaps if you know a little bit about psychology, and unfortunately Dr. Aaron Beck, who recently passed away, you would have heard about Dr. Aaron Beck, who's the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy. And he came up and did a lot of work around depression and the concept of the self, the other, and what people believe in relation to the future, and how those sort of beliefs impact someone's mental state of feeling depressed or depression. And then I want to kind of fast forward to some of Dick Schwartz's work, Richard Schwartz, and he talks about internal family systems, and that kind of sort of internal family systems version of the mind is all about kind of like the multiplicity of parts. So like a part of me, I don't know if any of you, there might be a part of you thinking, how the hell am I going to complete this horror project? And another part of you thinking, oh, I'm going to do totally well, right? That's a multiplicity. A part of me wants to go to the gym, and another part of me wants to eat pizza on the sofa. So we really are a multiplicity of different parts of ourselves, different neural networks. If you then sort of combine all of these concepts, so Freud and Jung and Beck and Dick Schwartz, and you bring them all together, you start to get an idea of the mind. But how do we actually connect molecule with mind? So that question that I was asking before, how do we take this sort of like blood and guts in our head, these sort of neural synapses, and then have a thought? I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable actually how that happens. So I'm now going to drop into a little bit of trauma and adversity. And it's one of the things, as Aki mentioned, that I've been specializing for years, fortunate enough to, in my day job, actually chat and be friends with all the leading trauma experts in the world, from people like Gabor Mate, that you would have heard about, Bessel van der Kolk, if you haven't read The Body Keeps a Score, other clinicians that are kind of involved in trauma, like Esther Perel, Brené Brown. These are kind of big names. These are kind of some of the people that I work with delivering programs and who are speakers for our company, and they do amazing work in helping people overcome sort of trauma and adversity. So if we just look at things like adverse child experience, so this is a study by Filippi et al. They looked at, some of the things that happen to children, and there are 10 categories, 3 categories of abuse, 2 categories of neglect, and 5 categories of household dysfunction. And they looked at these experiences about what impact would that then have on a developing mind and what that might mean for the future of this little human being. So we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I just want to sort of take you sort of through these two categories. So we've got, childhood adversity. We've then got like trauma on the other side. So again, racism, accidents, war, slavery, terrorism, transgenerational trauma, displacement, moral injury, COVID-19, right? These are all traumatic experiences. And the thing that I get really interested about is that, sometimes with trauma and adversity, we can separate it out. With trauma, we know that certain brain structures get really activated in the brain. So as I was talking previously, you get that sympathetic activation, you get that kind of maybe fast heart rate, you get that turning away from, you get that kind of flight response to run out the door when you see a horror film or something like a thriller, like it's way too scary. Adversity, on the other hand, is less traumatic. It doesn't stimulate perhaps some of those impulses in the brain to move away from, or that sympathetic activation, or in really kind of bad trauma. If I just talk about sort of the incident of rape, sometimes rape incidents might just sort of faint or forget what happened. And that's actually the other part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Most of you know that is responsible for the rest and digest, but actually it also has this other function that it can shut down the human body. So many of you would have perhaps seen an animal in the wild, or a cat eating a mouse, and when that happens, a little mouse can play dead, and that's really a survival response. We see that in humans too in extreme trauma. So the two things you're taking away from this slide is you're taking away that childhood adversity is kind of not that great, but trauma is even worse because it impacts the brain and can stay in the body and the brain to give rise to psychological disorders and psychological dysfunction later in life. Okay, so as I was saying, if we get a little bit more academic in that, in this, we can, when we think about trauma and adversity, it's highly correlated with mental health issues, psychiatric comorbidities. So research tells us, not 100%, that when children or adolescents experience a really bad time, they might have mental health issues later on in life. They might get a psychiatric diagnosis. Not always, thank God for epigenetics, and we're going to go there in a little bit, but sometimes really depends on the predisposition of a particular person. So let's just have a little look at what I've written here. Okay, so I'm just trying to break this down to make it make sense for you. One of the things that we get kind of interested in right now, well, certainly I'm interested in terms of trauma, is looking at how we combine the academic research into sort of the genome, so our genes, and kind of the environment, or environmental factors, and looking at that interface between genes and environment to give us that kind of gene environment interface. Because what it shows us is if we just look to our genes, our genome, our epigenome, what we start to see with people who have diagnosis or might at one point have a diagnosis is that we can do something called a polygenetic risk score. It highlights certain genes that are implicated in certain diagnoses, and it allows us to kind of look at, well, what might someone's predisposition be to trauma, or what might someone's predisposition to be towards depression, or what might someone's predisposition be towards PTSD. So we can start to get quite clever with trauma and mental health, and also some of the symptoms where maybe someone doesn't have a diagnosis but is presenting certain things to someone like me, where I would be thinking that person's definitely experienced something that's kind of stuck in their body and it's not been sorted out. And this kind of whole idea of combining kind of genes and psychology in terms of polygenetic risk scores takes us closer towards what's really happening in the human mind, and also as well in someone's sort of biology. Okay, and again, I just sort of, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can sort of see, I just sort of list some common trauma disorders from, I mean, anxiety is not a trauma disorder, but dissociative disorder, so DID, or PTSD, borderline personality disorder, many eating disorders. Again, these are kind of a lot of trauma experiences, but science only right now is starting to understand that they are trauma related. Okay, so again, you know, people don't often always have a diagnosis, yet they might have like sleepless nights or generalized anxiety or emotional overwhelm, insomnia, self-destructive behaviors such as cutting or nightmares. So when someone comes into my clinic or I'm doing an assessment with someone, they might not have a diagnosis. So I'm looking for other symptoms that are showing up physiologically. And for me as a clinician, as a highly trained individual, I'm looking for some of these symptoms that I'm thinking, wow, this sounds totally like trauma. How can I really help this person? And I'm not against diagnosis. I am actually for diagnosis in some circumstances, but I think there's so much that we can do with diagnosis or not diagnosis really to help people suffering from trauma and mental health issues. Okay, so this is a little saying which I really love. It says, trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. I can't tell you the hundreds of people that I've seen in my clinic who don't have a diagnosis, but who have trauma that we work to heal. So again, I'll just repeat that trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. So again, you know, someone might not have a diagnosis, but they'll have a whole group of these horrific memories that show up. And if you just sort of think about it, especially in this COVID time, so many people are having various symptoms because of the state of the world and the state of kind of what's going on. And I think there's one point that I want to make on this is that it's really important that we don't pathologize in a time where we are actually in a very abnormal situation in terms of the world. So, you know, it's really important to understand that the state of the world right now, this COVID, whole 2-year COVID thing that we've been through, if someone like me starts to pathologize people for having responses to a very, very stressful world, we've got a real problem. So I'll give you an example. I myself, I was due to do some great stuff on Christmas and some of my friends got COVID, so I wasn't able to go. And I was like, shit, like my whole Christmas is cancelled. And then I kind of started to, you know, blame myself. There was a part of me that came in and I just realized, like, what are you doing? We're in like a COVID crisis here. And here I am. I do these lectures often. So here I am pathologizing my own internal dialogue. You know, it had nothing to do with me. It was all about COVID. So again, here I am just sort of saying, we're in this time, in this world where you really just want to be watching your internal dialogue, your mental state, and not pathologizing because there is an invisible Godzilla out there, and none of this is really our fault. So if we just fast forward a little bit, we can see that in the human body, trauma can impact our neurobiological timescale. So I'm going to break that down a little bit. Let's have a think. I'm going to talk horror, but I'm not going to talk it from kind of a playful way. I'm going to kind of talk the horror of war or the horror of displacement in terms of people in countries. So those sort of things are kind of horrific. And if we kind of take something like the Holocaust, we know now that those people who were in the Holocaust and in the war suffered tremendous shock and horror from some of the experiences that happened. And if we have a look at some of the epigenomes, so those are kind of changes that happen in the environment around a gene, we can see that they bypass generations. So, you know, if we think about our grandparents and our grandparents' grandparents, we can sometimes see there's a genetic predisposition to a mental health issue because trauma impacts our epigenetics. So it might not mean that anything happens to me in my lifetime, but it might be that something happened to my grandmother, which means that I could be predisposed to something, a traumatic diagnosis, because it's kind of running in my family, right? This is inherent in the family. So you can see here that, you know, trauma, you know, impacts, it's really pervasive. It impacts across time. And the good thing about it is that we can actually heal some of these timestamps through therapy. So it's kind of not all bad news. And I'm going to come to some research that lets us know that we can just do that. So just a key thing here, trauma, it's really pervasive. We really want to work through it. We want to be in a really good state to, if we suffer trauma adversity, that we're able to be in a state, our nervous system is in a state that enables our bodies to process whatever we experience. And a lot of the time people come into clinic because what's actually happening is their brain, or the brain networks or the brain structures, have not processed the event, right? That's kind of really what trauma is about, is that the ability, which we have this exceptional computing system that I was talking about, something kind of gets a little bit stuck in that kind of computational model to help process it. So that's why there are people, lots of people like me in the world, which help people process that traumatic experience so they don't have this neurobiological timestamp, which is more dysfunctional than functional over a period of time. Okay, so again, I just want to refer to this really great study. It's by sort of Professor Rachel Yehuda. She's out of the University of Mount Sinai, and she did this study on trauma, Holocaust survivors. And what they actually found is that, I'm just sort of, this is like a very quick summary, is what they found that with doing certain types of psychotherapy, they could reverse that kind of epigenetic effect, which means that trauma, having psychotherapy and doing certain things could really help heal the brain and the epigenome, which, if you remember, it's genes that change over generations. So we can actually help heal what happens in the future by being conscious of what happened to our ancestors, our families, in the here and the now, as we look to recover from whatever happened. And one of the things that I haven't really spoken about, and I've taken you on a little bit of a journey, and I want to take you back to the brain. So this is a very, very simplistic model of the brain. It's MacLean's 1979 triune brain. And here he, you know, breaks it down into the neocortex, which is all like this sort of top part of our brain, our limbic brain, which is sort of the midbrain, and then that reptilian brain, which is right at the back. And you know, one of the things about trauma, if you just think about it in terms of horror or thriller, something that you're watching on Netflix or whatever, is, you know, it's the past that enters the present. So if something is really scary, it's been scary before, right? So when a certain sound or something you see or whatever it is, your body, your nervous system is really attuned to that being kind of scary. So that's why trauma is really can be pervasive. It can be really frightening, because what we're seeing in the here and the now is somebody's past come into the present right now. So the brain thinks that whatever happened back then is happening in the here and now. But for you and I, we know that the past isn't in the present. The past should be in the past. So in terms of what I do as a profession, is I help people leave the past in the past so they can get on and live in the present. Because a lot of time with kind of trauma and mental health issues is that what's ever being activated in the brain has come from the past. It's not like it's actually happening right now. And some of those, like, you know, just in your general lives, you might be able to kind of think about, you know, the same thing, or I don't know, just let's take something that is common to everyone. Maybe the same relationship issue comes into your relationships. So that could be something. Or you see the same family pattern coming into, you know, that argument that happens at Christmas, right? This is just a normal thing that is in the past and it comes into the present. And some of the things that it does is it it presents as what we call, as I was talking about when I said the brain is the seat of implicit and explicit memory, it presents as implicit memory. So if we think about what that might look like, it might look like when you see a particular stimulus or you hear a particular stimulus, you get maybe shaking or numbing, something that's really, really scary. You start to kind of get that body memory coming back because it remembers how scared it was in the nervous system. And you know, often in my clinic, you know, one of the things that we do and becomes a clinical focus is to focus on the explicit trigger, the explicit activation that's really kind of terrifying for people, and remove that. So when they see, hear, taste, smell, or feel that particular stimulus, again, it doesn't elicit all this other kind of really bad symptoms, such as not sleeping, or someone just wants to run out the room, or someone gets really frightened, their breath gets short. So do you see how you know, trauma is pervasive in many ways, because it doesn't really allow people to live in the present moment, but kind of hijacks our systems to living in the past. And if you just kind of think about that, well, let's just think about that in relation to this sort of learning, right? If I'm not fully here, if I'm not fully present with this group, and I'm thinking about something in the past or the future, my whole attentional span to kind of learning from my colleagues and what's going on, and maybe something that Aggie said or whatever, is being hijacked because my attention, my awareness is totally somewhere else. So, you know, that's why I was sort of saying that trauma is so pervasive. It doesn't always, but it can really upset many, many elements of someone's life, from learning to their families, to their relationships, to playing sport, whatever it is. Okay, just looking at time, we've got 7 minutes, right? It's going to be really, really fast. So I was talking about this before, you know, Viktor Frankl, as you know, Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp. So, you know, he said an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. So what he's meaning, if we just think about that in the context of COVID and the context of trauma, we really want to normalize that when someone comes into, for example, my office and is sitting there, maybe it's a male or a female, and they've just had a horrific experience, and they something like, you know, I just want to fucking kill her or kill him, and maybe something really bad has happened. You kind of want to go, that totally makes sense, right? So again, we want to normalize experience. We want to normalize this issue of, for example, COVID. You know, I don't know about you. I know catching the crumb has become quite trendy. Now, I don't know what your age is, but for me, that doesn't hit my kind of trend mark. But I was hearing from some students the other day, like, if you've got the crumb, you're kind of in. If you haven't had it, you're out. And I was just thinking, oh my God, I think I was born too long ago for things to become trendy. But where I'm going with this is that, you know, for example, like COVID, what used to happen and might not be happening so much now, but maybe in the older populations, or people are still a bit nervous, they're hesitant to go out, right? They're hesitant to be around people. Do I hug someone and kiss them, or do I not? Do I go out and be in a cinema or a football stadium, or do not? What's my body saying? So again, we want to kind of normalize that experience, because it's normal for the body to pull away from a frightening experience, rather, as I was talking earlier on, about pathologizing it. So if we just look at these two little graphs, we can see, if we look at Felici's study, that when we have sort of adverse childhood experiences and trauma, there's lots of research to show that it results in death, early death, as well as disease. So absolutely, here we are connecting adversity and trauma to molecule and mind. It doesn't have a great trajectory in terms of what the science is showing. However, We look at the studies that are coming out from, Yehuda's lab and many others, and we can look to trauma adversity, and we can see that through the process of specific therapies, we can reverse those epigenetic changes for greater health and well-being. So again, this is just a very, very, very short snippet of what we're seeing, but the research is there, and it's being proven in lots of sort of RCT. So this is really an exciting time to get to understand, if you're fascinated with the brain, if you're fascinated with the body, there's some amazing things happening there. Again, just different types of trauma, acute or single incident trauma. So that might be if I've had a really good upbringing, and then maybe I go and have, I don't know, a car accident or a bike accident. So that's like a single incident trauma. People can get PTSD or chronic trauma, usually if there's been sort of adversity in childhood and then they have another trauma. So you can see we kind of like, it's building. There's relational trauma, so that could be where there's been trauma, relational, so interpersonal trauma within the family. Particularly as a clinician, I would also always ask a question when I'm doing assessments, was either one of your caregivers either frightened or frightening? Because for me as a clinician, I'm thinking, okay, what was going on in that baby's brain or that child's brain as the child is growing up? If I'm getting a yes to either one of them, I'm thinking, okay, their system is sympathetically activated, and I would be thinking about my hypothesis in terms of a treatment model. So again, you get developmental trauma, which is similar to relational trauma growing up. And then you get complex trauma, such as dissociative identity disorder or dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. So it's not really on the brinks of DID, but it is dissociative. So again, a dissociation would be someone's really, when you're talking to them, you can just see that you're not relating to them properly. They're not really there. They're off with the fairy somewhere on the one spectrum, like on the DID side. And actually often in horror, like if we just kind of think about, I'm just going to be like really gory. If we think about serial killers, right, that kind of really pathological sort of mind, they're dissociated, right? We as human beings have certain things in place that stop us harming other people. And usually when people harm other people or do sort of horrific things, actually there was a runner, I think in Ireland, that recently got murdered. Someone went out for a run. That bloke that did that, he is in a part of himself doing something. He's completely dissociated from reality. So again, if I think about someone like him, or I think about certain people in prison or people that commit crimes, there's usually complex trauma. They usually had a super shit upbringing. So again, just something to think about when you hear about people that don't do great things. One of the questions you also want to ask yourself, I bet there is complex trauma there, and actually some of the things that they're probably doing to people, or they might be wanting to do to people, whatever it is something that happened in their background, in their family upbringing. Right, I've got a minute to like go through a whole bunch of stuff. So it all comes down to this. No, I'm joking. It doesn't all come down to this. It comes down to a bit of this. What this little graph is one of Dan Siegel's work, and it's called the window of tolerance. So really, it's a kind of conceptualization of our nervous system. In the middle of the graph, you can see there's something called the window of tolerance, and it's where our nervous system can kind of tolerate day-to-day experience. When we get more stress, so if you go onto the orange and the red, you can see we start to get more anxious, we start to get more hyper-aroused, there's an escalation in our stress levels. On the other side, so the hyper-arousal, the dissociation, is actually where we feel flat, right? We just collapse. I was talking about rape before. We often see that in a rape situation, and where you see somebody just totally helpless because their body has that kind of very mammalian and correct response. So this as a system, the window of tolerance is a really good kind of like, day-to-day calibration of where you are. You always want to be in the window of tolerance because it means that you can regulate your emotions, you can regulate your affect, you can be calm and collected. And you know, a lot of our Apple Watches or our devices are tracking HRV nowadays, and this all has to do with this specific kind of window of tolerance. We really want to kind of modulate our arousal, so kind of our stress responses up or down. I'm not talking about sexual arousal, I'm just talking about kind of how our body kind of gets totally stressed out and kind of seems to go up, or maybe we feel a little bit flat and depressed and hypo and we go down. And then these are just some tools and tricks for you. So if just something for you to think about, right? If you're suffering from trauma or adversity, just some things to think about. You want to build relationships with people that you really trust and feel safe with. There's no point in being around people that kind of freak you out, because that just stresses, again, that nervous system. You kind of want to connect your symptoms with triggers. So like if you feel frightened, or like, for example, I was saying before, I don't like horror programs. So I'm not going to go sit down tonight and watch Netflix and freak my system out, because I know that watching a horror program is a trigger for me. And we can take that little, you know, hypothetical situation into our day-to-day lives. So notice what kind of triggers in the world, what activates your nervous system, what's really traumatic for you. Because if you kind of, you know, stop moving towards those triggers, you can really calm your nervous system down. Remember to just sort of label symptoms as symptoms. So rather than saying, oh, there's something wrong with me, I've got insomnia, there's something wrong with me, see it as something else. It's a cause, you know, something else caused that insomnia, or something else caused that, I don't know, eating disorder or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be about you. It's usually there's a causation, and that causation, as I've been talking about, is usually something like trauma or adversity. And let's just yeah, and then just do things that help kind of really expand that window of tolerance. So do things that really bring pleasure, happiness, joy to your system, whether it's meditation, cycling, knitting, looking at horror programs. So some people really like that. Whatever it is, do what brings your body, you know, well-being, to get optimum mental health. Because the more that we can be in tune with this brain, this body, the more our processes, our minds, what we do in the world come into effect, and we're able to sort of learn and just really be great human beings as we are. So as Bessel van der Kolk says, if you don't know Bessel's work, do have a look. He's one of the leading psychiatrists on trauma in the world. He's written a book called Body Keeps a Score, New Times in New York, and #1 bestseller. And he says the body keeps a score because our bodies are really the seat of our minds. And when we understand our bodies, they tell us and they can allow us to heal from really many, many things, rather than just believing our cognition. So I was 4 minutes late, sorry, that's it from me. And if you want all the references, I've got loads of references that you can look up the academic work. Over to you, Aggie.
Fabulous, Tracy, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for being so on time. It's really fascinating. So I'm sure everyone probably has questions. So does anyone want to kick us off with any questions for Tracy? Kat.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm actually focusing on transgenerational memory, which is going to encompass a little bit about trauma in my project that I'm doing. So I just wanted to ask you, like, is there specific therapeutic interventions that you're knowledgeable about for that kind of trauma, like like an epigenetic sense, like maybe not an event that's happened in someone's life, like as you were saying, kind of like these comorbid traumas, like an adverse experience and then an event, but like actual historical trauma that's been passed down through the genes. Like say if you're in your family there's a Holocaust victim, or if there's like a generation who experienced conflict.
So I think so I'm going to do my duty, and I'm going to give the academic answer, and then I'm going to give the non-academic answer, so you can go sort of two pathways. So absolutely, you can look to Dr. Rachel Yehuda's work, who I mentioned, and there's a lot of work on Holocaust, and I wasn't too sure which modality of psychotherapy they used to sort of change those epigenetics, but there are lots of treatments that we can do now. So again, in the UK, and I know a lot of you from all over the world, but most countries have their approved list of working with whatever the issue is. So yes, there are lots of modalities that treat it. In the UK, we go to NICE approved therapies, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. Is CBT going to heal transgenerational trauma? I don't think so. If you go to something like internal family systems, which is not a NICE approved therapy, yes, look at Dick Schwartz's work. There's a woman called Kay Gardner. She does really, really powerful stuff. So again, there's lots of things taking place that do help heal transgenerational trauma on both the academic side as well as sort of the more non-academic side. I mean, I do know that there is sort of research going into more RCTs for certain modalities, but you must remember RCTs are usually over £1 million. So, right now it's up to the modalities that are funded by the government, and that kind of get the most research. So again, in answer to your question, yes, they are. Look up Rachel Yehuda's work, and you'll then kind of go on a bit of a journey into sort of what modalities heal transgenerational trauma. Actually, also Dr. Kate Shard, so she does called cognitive processing therapy, which is also a NICE approved trauma therapy, again, working with sort of veterans and people who have been in war. Again, I don't know if they've done any epigenetic research on that, but you could check it out.
Thank you. That's a lot of stuff to look at. Great. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Anyone else? Maybe whilst everyone's thinking, I have a couple of questions, Tracy. So one thing I was really interested in what you were talking about, this idea that reversing the epigenetic effect. And I was really interested in the fact that obviously it can't ever be a one size fits all, can it? Though you meet people who have these extremely different circumstances, but would you say the body sort of reacts in a general fashion? Do you find very different people, regardless of their experience, their body still goes through a sort of normalized process, or is that, or do you also have to, now you're thinking about the epigenome, do you also have to relate it to the people's bodies as well?
That's a really good question. So actually, it's one of the things that I'm really passionate about is, so when we have an individual, and obviously there are billions of us in the world, so what does that actually mean? I mean, so this is where it becomes quite complex, because we all have a different constitution. And when we look at things like polygenic risk scores, we all have sort of different risk scores for certain things. So maybe in my family, I've got heart disease and cancer. In your family, you've got, I don't know, neurological disorder and MS. I don't know. I'm just making this up. On the mental health side, I've got anxiety and trauma. You've got depression and borderline. So what you sort of see is you see us, every individual being predisposed, having the genetics that predispose us to a certain condition, whether it's a disease or whether it's a mental health diagnosis. But the factors that kind of really implicate that, because I could be a person that had no trauma or adversity in my childhood, in my upbringing, and my polygenetic risk score, just say, for example, to depression is really high. So epigenetically, in terms of that inherited transgenerational trauma, I'm picking that up from some of my grandmothers or grandfathers, and it's coming into the here and now. Very seldom that's the case, though. On the flip side, you can have people who experience a huge amount of a trauma and adversity, and they have no mental health issues because they've got a great sort of epigenome and genome. They've got fantastic resilience in their body. So again, there is no set way. It doesn't mean that if you've had trauma in your family, you're going to have sort of mental health issues. And it doesn't mean if you've had no trauma that you won't. It's highly unlikely, but you can't be 100% sure. So again, it's totally different for every single person. And the good news is that we have got therapies and are making therapies, whether it's sort of, psychotherapy modalities or, pharmacology, or even using pharmacotherapeutics to, help heal sort of brain and mental health. So it's a complex picture, but you must remember only 20% of people, so there's 80% of people who have trauma and adversity don't have mental health issues. It's only 20% of the population, so we want to get really interested in that population, what's happening with their sort of predisposition and their genetic makeup with those kind of environmental factors to give rise to whatever it is that someone suffers from. So, conclusion is that there's lots of a trauma and adversity. It's part of the world, happens to many, many people. Yes, some people are highly affected by it. And the good news is a lot of us aren't. So, just something to think about.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to ask another one. Sorry. Yeah, this is so fascinating. But one thing I found really interesting as well in your talk, that you were saying this idea that like you can get stuck in a cycle almost, or that, and so is trauma habit forming, or is it like what's happening now? Do you just does your body get used to reacting, or is it you said that there are these certain ways that that you utilize that can break the cycle, but is it habitual, I suppose, is my question.
Absolutely, brain networks are habitual. Whether trauma forms habits is a completely different question. We kind of need to look at what is the habituation you're talking about. So if we think about our different brain cells and how our brain works, the brain works in terms of doing the same things over and over again. That doesn't have to be trauma induced. That's just sort of how our brain works and our networks work. But absolutely, that trauma can be, can give rise to certain behaviors which are habitual. For example, alcohol, excessive alcohol and drug use are a means to calm the system. So when someone sort of starts abusing drugs or alcohol, a lot of that is around, well, they're doing something. It was once sort of adaptive, right? It once made a lot of sense. I'm going to have a drink tonight because I've had a super stressful day. Maybe that was, I don't know, at 16 years old, and like, oh God, I actually felt quite good afterwards, right? Well, tomorrow, I went into school and that damn bully, he bullied me again. Don't worry, I'm going to go home and I'm going to have another drink. And on the weekend, I smoked some weed. It totally chilled me out. I did not have to think about Bobby who hit me, right? So you can kind of see how a trauma incident can lead to habituation through the use of something else, for example, like drugs and alcohol. So then that process, that thinking pattern, that behavior becomes habitual. There are many, many instances where I could give you diagnosis or symptoms or behaviors that are habitual and stem from trauma. And there are many other things that we do that are habitual, that do not stem from trauma. So in answer to your question, yes and no.
Could I also ask as well, because I suppose one thing we're doing on this course is we're looking at ways to perhaps deal with natural occurring horror and using art horror, so like horror that we generate like in films and things. And a lot of, we've learned from other lecturers that actually people find experiencing horror sometimes like cathartic, because you can deal with things, or maybe you get something out of your system. Like how ethical do you think it is that we're doing that? I mean, do you think that it depends who we're talking to, or because we're having a lot of conversations about audience and who we're directing the art horror towards, but I'm just interested to get your thoughts on it, because it's something that we're trying to do in a way that will raise questions, but also in the right places.
Yeah, good question. What do you think?
Well,
where do you go with that? Like, what comes to mind?
If I were to answer that, I think, and maybe this is what I'm probably getting at, so leaning towards, is that it totally depends on who you're aiming it towards and for what purpose and the types of questions that you're asking. So I suppose we're all trying to think about our audience very precisely. We've just had a tutorial session on, how to contact the right people to ask the right, to collaborate with, to ask the right questions, to intervene. But I'm just sort of interested from a psychological standpoint, if that helps.
I think there are many sort of psychological explanations to something like this, where I go because I see the horror that trauma leaves, and it's not great. I see lives being lost. I have patients that have committed suicide because of horror and trauma. It's not great. So where I go with my clinical hat on, and then I'll move hats as well, is I go to, if I was putting on a project, I would want to put on a disclaimer. So, there's something, if you are sensitive to such and such, this might not be for you. Kind of like what you see on TV, you get these disclaimers about domestic violence, sexual violence, language, etc., etc. Is it ethical depending on the audience? I think it's a massive question. I mean, you will, in my ethics, I do not want to re-traumatize someone. I see so much trauma. I see the impact of trauma. I see their lives lost to trauma. I do not ever want to re-traumatize someone. If I am re-traumatizing someone, I want to stop. However, if I put a different hat on, just say I put, not my clinical self. So here I am going to the Wellcome Trust or coming to your exhibition, wherever it is, and you've got your projects out, or it's a play or whatever it is. And I'm looking at this from just my creative hat self and my interest self, and there's a little disclaimer, and I'm not triggered by whatever horror, then there's nothing wrong with it. But again, if you're, it depends what's the intention behind this. Like, if you're just trying to create impact for the sake of like shocking someone, for me clinically, I would question that. I would clinically question the intention around that, and where does that come from in somebody's mind. But if this is really about other things, then again, it's about other things. So I guess this is a really complex question on ethics, and where you go with it, and where is this coming from, not only within your conscious, but within your unconscious. So obviously, as a clinician, I'm not just, right now, I don't look around the room and go, or analyze. I'm not an analyst. I'm not an analyst at all, but I don't think about things, or clinicians like me, we don't think about things like this. But when we're working with someone, we would think about things like this. So, for example, what might be going on in someone's unconscious if the intention was to shock an audience? What is that about? Let's get super curious. So it's not that it's a good or a bad thing. It's like, wow, that's interesting. Let's explore that place. Like, what's going on there? So again, it's such a big question that I don't know if I can fully answer it, and I don't really know what the right answer is. I don't even think there is a right answer, because we can then go on to things around, you know, we have things like freedom of speech, freedom of creativity, freedom to express, all those kind of things. So where does this then come in? We should be able to express the different parts of ourselves with different needs and all that kind of thing. So again, you know, it's really, really complex. I think it gets quite interesting. It's quite edgy. And it's an interface, it's an intersection, isn't it? And I think, you know, as long as you've got like the right questions and the right intention and really kind of working on that kind of edge, and there is, you know, good intention around it, I don't know, it's all right. But you do want to perhaps ask that unconscious question, rather than just think about this consciously.
Thank you so much. That's an amazing place to end. And I think that, yeah, we all need to think a little bit more about how, well, the disclaimer is such an interesting idea, but also how we interrogate that in our own work. So Tracy, thank you so much. Such a fascinating talk. Please keep in touch, and thank you for sharing this with us. If you would be happy to share your email with the students, that would be wonderful. But thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. I hope you found that helpful. Good luck with your studies and your projects. And I know a little bit of Nelly, and I think this is sort of a great thing, and a great thing that Aggie's doing. And if you need any questions or anything answering, or need a point academically, just email me. You can email me at tracy@tracyjarvis.co.uk. Access me through any one of my companies. And really good luck. It sounds like it's going to be totally awesome. So yeah, shout if you need anything, and thanks again. Yeah, thanks. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye, Tracy. Thank you.